Welcome to Radical Engagement. And we continue our long slog through Bordiga. If you're new here, don't start with episode 15. You can either start with the beginning of the document, which I think is around episode 9 of this series, or start back at 1 because you're going to need historical context for this. I'm going to remind people of certain historical context as we go through it. But you know, kind of like my hair, there are some days that are better than others for me keeping up with it. So let's get into the text here. All right, so we're in the Italian section, which is the Italian question section, which is section 3, specific to the Italian Communist Party in 1926. We've gone through some of the factions. We've talked about the relationships to the Maximalists and Reformists and the PSI, the Socialist Party of Italy. Now we're talking about the Ordine Nouveauist, which is for the Ordine Nouveau, or the New Order faction. Now, the New Order faction was Gramsci's faction, and it was the joining of the left faction and the New Order faction that formed the Communist Party in the first place. In Bordigism land, and actually even in some Marxists, these people are called the Marxist center as opposed to the left faction, where the Reformist and about half of the Maximalists are in the right faction, and then you have the people who left and became fascist outright. And then you have the split amongst the syndicalists. It all goes kind of crazy, but let's get in here. The Ordine Nouveau group was formed in Turin by a group of intellectuals whose contact with the proletariat masses and industry at the time, when the abstentionist faction in Turin already had a large following. Who established contacts with the proletarian masses and the industry at the time, when the abstentionist faction in Turin already had a large following. All right, now, I mean, Bordiga himself is from an intellectual tradition, but we don't hold that against him. The volatile ideology of this group is mainly derived from philosophical conceptions of a bourgeois and idealist nature, partly inherited from Benedetto Croce. Now, remember, he's talking about Gramsci here. This group aligned itself with communist directives very late in the day. It would always display residual errors linked to its origins. It understood the significance of the Russian Revolution too late to be able to apply it usefully to the proletarian struggle in Italy. In November 1917, Comrade Gramsci published an article in Avanti asserting that the Russian Revolution had given a lie to Marxist historical materialism and the theories of capital. That's Lenin versus Capital, by the way. That is a famous Gramscian essay. I know exactly what essays he's talking about here. I should probably cover that essay, because it's a very strange essay in some ways, and it's very short, and gave an essentially idealist explanation. The extreme left current that the Youth Federation belongs to responded immediately to this article. The subsequent ideological development of the Ordine Nouveauist group, as their publication of Ordine Nouveau shows, has led to a non-Marxist and non-Leninist interpretation of the workers' movement. I would like specifically how it's non-Leninist, because both Gramsci and Bordiga are claiming Lenin's legacy. All right. The question of the role of the unions and the party, armed struggle, and the conquest of power and the construction of socialism are not posed correctly in their theory. Okay, how are they not posed? Bordiga, give us more specifics. You can't, assert, but also elaborate. Come on, dude. And they have evolved instead of the conception of systemic organization of the laboring classes, which was necessary rather than voluntary and strictly bound up with the mechanisms of capitalist social production. Now, I want to bracket out here. The antagonism between Gramsci and Bordiga was ideological and ideational, and it was very real. But Bordiga was still allies with him in many ways. They were in the same party, and when Gramsci was in prison, Bordiga seems to have, according to the records that we have, tried to help him escape. We don't know why nothing came of it, but it was definitely something the two of them discussed, and that is recorded. Setting out from the internal commissions, this system was supposed to culminate simultaneously in the Proletarian Communist International, in the Soviets and the worker state by the way of factory councils, which were held to embody the latter even before the collapse of capitalist power. All right, so Bordiga is basically accusing the Ordine Nouveauists of being either syndicalist or cancelist. And what is more, even during the bourgeois epoch, the system was supposed to assume the function of constructing the new economy by calling for and exercising workers' control over production. Later on, all the non-Marxist elements of the Ordine Nouveauist ideology, utopianism, Proudhonist binary syndicalism, that's because they overemphasize the cancels, and economic gradualism before the conquest of power, i.e. reformism, were apparently dropped in order to be gradually subsumed by an entirely different theories of Leninism. However, the fact that this substitution took place on a superficial and fictitious level can only be avoided if the Ordine Nouveauist hadn't split from and opposed the left. So he's saying basically, you betrayed us. A group whose traditions, rather than converging with the Bolsheviks in an entirely impulsive way, represented a serious contribution derived not from academic and bookish dissertation on the bourgeois tomes, but from proletarian class experience. Sure. Certainly this was actually true that the workers' militants were more aligned with the left faction at that time, which is why they had to pull shenanigans to get Bordiga out of power. And that's kind of admitted in even official history now. You can see episodes of this series 2, 3, 4, and 5 on that. But anyway, I'm not so sure that Bordiga later can say that they are an academic. Certainly, the Ordine Nouveauists hadn't prevented from learning and improving the strictly collaborative framework, which was lacking later on. As it turned out, we greeted the announcement of the Ordine Nouveauist leaders with a certain tinge of irony when they announced that they were Bolshevizing the very people who had actually set them on the road to Bolshevik positions by serious and Marxist means, rather than by chatting about mechanistic and bureaucratic procedures. Up until shortly before the 1920 World Congress, the Ordine Nouveauists were opposed to a split in the old party, and they posed all-out trade union questions incorrectly. The International's representative in Italy had to polemicize against them on the question of factory councils and the premature constitution of the Soviets. In April 1920, the Turin section approved the famous Ordine Nouveau thesis, which were drawn up by Comrade Gramsci and adopted by a committee composed of both Ordine Nouveauists and abstentionists. These theses cited in the Second Congress Revolution, in fact, expressed, despite disagreements about election, the common thinking of the nascent communist fraction. They weren't distinctly Ordine Nouveauist positions, but consisted of points already clarified and accepted by the party's left wing long before. So he's saying, we agreed with them then, except about elections. But we accepted the Comintern's decision and Lenin's decision about that for party discipline reasons, even though we thought it was wrong. That's what Bordiga is saying here. The Ordine Nouveauists would rally around the left positions on the International for a while, but the thinking expressed in the Rome thesis were essentially different from theirs, even if they considered it opportune to vote for them. The true precursor of Ordine Nouveauism, present adherence to tactics in the general line of the International, is really Comrade Tasca and his opposition to the left at the Rome Congress. Now, who's Tasca? So, Angelo Tasca was a historian and politician and writer. He was a founding member of the Communist Party of Italy, but was expelled in 1929 for his opposition of Stalinism and supporting the right opposition of Nikolai Bukharin. He rejoined the French section. He seemed to collaborate with the Vichy France, but then was actually an anti-fascist spy. So it's actually hard to know where he landed. What he was associated with is more interesting. So Tasca was one of the people who was really interested in hegemony as such, and a lot of Gramsci seems to come from Gramsci and him. So it seems very hard to understand if Tasca was sincere in his collaboration with the Vichy regime, or if he was just a spy, or both. It's very opaque. And different scholars have come on different conclusions. But one of the things that made Tasca interesting was the focus on both the Bukharinite market socialism thesis and the fact that Tasca focused a lot on proletarian culture and culture in general. His relationship to fascism is very contested. And that makes him a very strange figure to talk about. But this is before that. He doesn't get kicked out of the party. He gets kicked out of the party 2 years after Bordiga is removed. And he is also kind of bracketed out of a lot of the party's history because of his questionable relationship to the Vichy regime. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. Given, on one hand, that the Ordinist group characteristic particularism and its taste for concrete inherited from idealist bourgeois positions, and on the other hand, that superficial and therefore incomplete adherence allowed for by the international leadership, we are forced to conclude, despite all their loud protestations of orthodoxy, that the theoretical adherence of a decisively important terms of providing the basis of actual policies, or the Ordinist to Leninism, is about as worthless as their adherence to the Rome thesis. So Bordiga, if Bordiga had got these through, it would have split the left faction from the center anyway. I think Bordiga's overstating some of the differences, and his relationship to Gramsci, as I mentioned, is pretty complicated. Later, Bordigists, pretty much by the Togliatti, I'm never sure if you pronounce the G. I think I've been told you don't, but I can't help it. Reconfiguration of the Gramscian myth, and it was really a myth, which again gets kind of inverted again in the New Left because of some hesitation that Gramsci had about kicking Trotsky and the left opposition out, which was stated in private papers. All right. But anyway, 6, the political work of the present party leadership. From 1923 until now, the work of the party leadership, which we must bear in mind took place in very difficult circumstances, has led to mistakes which were essentially similar to those pointed out apropos the international question, but which have already been severely aggravated, at least partly, by the Ordo Nouveauist deviations. Participating in the 1924 elections was a very fortunate political act, but one cannot say the same about the proposal for joint action with the socialist parties, nor the way it was labeled proletarian unity. Just as deplorable was the excessive tolerance towards some of those of Terzini's electoral maneuvers. But the most serious problems are posed to propose the open crisis that followed Matteotti's assassination. Remember, Matteotti was assassinated and it led to the Aventine crisis and a kind of left unity attempt with bourgeois parties, kind of a proto-popular front, actually. All right. The leadership policies were based on the observed view that the weakening of fascism would propel the middle classes into action first, and then the proletariat. This implied, on one hand, a lack of faith in the capacity of the proletariat to act as a class, despite its continued alertness under the suffocating strictures of fascism, and on the other, an overestimation of the initiative of the middle class. In fact, even referring to the clear Marxist theoretical positions on the matter, the central lesson to draw from the Italian experience has been that the intermediary layers will passively tail alongside the strongest and may therefore back either side. Thus, in 1919 and 1920, they backed the proletariat. Then from 1921, 22, and 23, they went behind fascism. And now, after a significant period of major upheaval in 1924-25, they are backing fascism again. The leadership were mistaken in abandoning the parliament and participating in the first meeting of the Aventine when they should have remained in parliament, launched a political attack on the government, and immediately taking up a position opposed to the moral and constitutional prejudices of the Aventine. I want to point out here that Bordiga has not yet taken his absolutely no electoralism stances. Here he's saying we can't form joint governments and our participation in parliament has to just be tactical, which is kind of Marx's position, actually. I'm going to give Bordiga some continuity here. Marx would always get mad when members of the SPD would try to form unity governments with bourgeois parties and the Bismarckian Second Reich. So you can see why this would be somewhat consistent. Later on, he takes this to mean absolutely no democracy. And you can kind of see this here. He already sees democracy as a democratic deviation and something inherent to capitalism. But he did still see the purpose in playing an oppositionary role in Parliament, which has been a historically Marxist position. Later on, he does not see the point in that. And that's interesting to me because he talks about the invariant program related to Lenin, and I'll get to that, but we have to get to later Bordiga for that to make a whole lot of sense. And we're not going to do that in this series. All right. All right. This wouldn't have prevented the communists from making the decision to abandon Parliament and would have allowed them to do so whilst keeping their specific identity intact and allowed them to leave only at the appropriate time, i.e. when the situation was ripe to call on the masses to take direct action. It was one of those crucial moments which affected the future situations will turn out. The error, therefore, was a fundamental one, a decisive test of leadership's capabilities, and it led to a highly unfavorable utilization by the working class, both of the weakening of fascism and the resulting failure of the Aventine. The return to Parliament in November 1924 and the statement issued by Repose were beneficial, as a wave of proletarian consensus showed, but they came too late. The leadership wavered for a long time and only finally made a decision under the pressure from the party and the left. The preparation of the party was made on the basis of dreary directives and a fantastically erroneous assessment of the situation's latent possibilities, report by Gramsci to the Central Committee, August 1924. The preparation of the masses was lent towards supporting the Aventine rather than wishing for its collapse, was in any case made worse when the party proposed the opposition parties that they set up their own anti-parliament. This tactic, in any case, conflicted with the decisions of the International, which never envisioned proposals being made to parties which were clearly bourgeois. Well, not yet. They do in the 1930s. It lay totally outside of the domain of communist principles and tactics and outside the Marxist conception of history. Any possible explanation that the leadership might have for this tactic aside, an explanation which was doomed to have very limited repercussions anyway, there is no doubt that it presented the masses with an illusory anti-state as opposed to warring against the traditional state apparatus, whilst in a historical perspective of our program, there is no basis for an anti-state other than the representation of the one productive class, namely the Soviet. To call for an anti-parliament relying in a country on the support of the workers' and peasants' committees meant entrusting the leadership of the proletariat to representatives of groups that are socially capitalist, like Amendola, Agnelli, Albertini, etc. Besides the certainty that such situation won't arise, a situation which could only be described as a betrayal anyway, just put it forward in the first place as the point of view derived from the communist proposal involving a betrayal of the principles and weakening of the revolutionary preparation of the proletariat. Other aspects of the work of the leadership also lend themselves to criticism. There have been a welter of watchwords that corresponded to neither genuine possibilities of realization nor any visible signs of agitation outside the party machine. The core demand for workers and peasants committees, justified in confusing and contradictory way, has never been understood nor abided by. And we're going to do section 7 because it's easy. The party's trade union activity. During the leadership of March 1925, metal workers strike and other... During the March 1925 metalworkers strike, another serious mistake was made. The leadership should have predicted that the proletariat's disillusionment with the Aventine would propel it into class actions and a wave of strikes. If the leadership had foreseen this, it might have been possible to push the FIOM into a national strike, just as it managed to get it to take part in the strike initiated by the fascists. By setting up a metalworkers agitation committee based on local organization, which throughout the country had been highly supportive of the strike. The stance of the leadership has taken on the trade unions hasn't corresponded clearly with the watchword of trade union unification inside the Confederation, a watchword that should still be adhered to despite the organizational decomposition of the latter. The party's direction on the unions has shown evidence of Orvo Nuvinist eras as regards to action in the factories. Not only has it created, or is proposing to create, a multitude of conflicting organisms in the factories, but it has frequently issued watchwords that depreciate trade unions and the idea of their necessity as an organ of the proletarian struggle. Yeah, Leninists are often kind of all over the place on that. I mean, I will say that, like, both the people who are cautious on trade union struggles and people like Bordiga who are supportive of them have good Lenin backup for their claims. A consequence of this era was a paltry settlement of the fiat in Turin, and as was the confusion surrounding factory elections, where the criteria for choosing between classes or party list of candidates, that is, on the trade union terrain, wasn't posed correctly. I would like to know how it was posed. I just don't know. I think this is one of those things where this would be more obvious to people who are specialists in Italian history than, say, in Italian labor history than, say, me. But I can see the general problem here, that the messaging about what the communist relationship to the labor union should be is totally unclear. All right. We're going to stop here because the next section is also pretty long, but this should be, our next episode should be the final one. So hope you enjoy it.